Hey everyone, welcome back to Crime Family. I'm your co-host AJ, and I'm here with my sisters Stephanie and Katie, as always. And this is episode 2 of season 6 and part 2 of our 3-part discussion or deep dive into one of the most pressing issues of our time with the drug and opioid epidemic that's currently happening. So last week, you heard our interview with Brian Townsend. It was a very, very great interview. I know I learned a lot from it. And so this week, we are excited to have another guest on the show. And we have a really great conversation with Dusty. And he speaks with us about his personal experiences with opioid addiction within his own family. So Dusty, who currently lives in the state of Indiana, which is actually one of the hardest hit states in the US by the opioid crisis. He opens up about his mother's struggle with addiction while he was growing up. And he provides a deeply personal perspective on the impact of addiction, not just on individuals, but on the families and the communities surrounding that person. And additionally, Dusty talks to us on, how the political climate in Indiana exacerbates the opioid epidemic and makes recovery and support more challenging for those in need. So throughout this episode, we'll hear Dusty's powerful story, discuss the societal factors at play, and explore the urgent need for change in the way that we approach addiction and recovery. So we're very excited to have Dusty on the show. So this interview with him was pre-recorded a little while ago. So we are just going to go right to our interview with Dusty. So here it is. Welcome, Dusty, to the show. Thank you so much for coming to chat with us today.
Thanks for having me.
No worries. So the first question I have here for you, will just kind of kick it off. So I know that you have some, lived experience with opioid addiction within your family and things like that. So if you're able to kind of just tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of a little bit about that experience, and kind of took you to where you are today.
All right. Well, I grew up in Northwest Indiana, not too far from Chicago. So the area I grew up in had a pretty big opioid issue just because of the proximity to the city. Um, I didn't really realize it when I was little, but my mother struggled with opioid addiction. Um, Nothing that I really noticed until I was about middle school aged. My parents had gotten divorced. My dad never had an issue with anything like this. He was always very clean. I don't think I even saw him drink a beer until I was in high school. He did not want to have that kind of stuff around us. But my mom, she had a problem with it, and it really took control of her in those later years. And around the time I was 13, she had gotten divorced again from my stepfather, just her supporting us at the time. And we ended up moving in to this apartment. It was like a duplex, split level. So it was a house. We lived on the top floor. And then there was a woman and her kid, I think, who lived down on the bottom floor. 3-bedroom place, just enough room for her, me, my brother, and then my 2 younger siblings. It was kind of tight quarters, but we made it work. Once we had moved in there, the signs that something was going on started coming in pretty quick. Like within the first few weeks, I noticed suddenly there was blankets covering all the windows. We didn't have curtains or anything. There was like thick winter blankets that had been tacked up over the windows that we were not supposed to open. Sometimes, there would be utilities, we'd have heat. Sometimes we wouldn't. The water was always cold, but to be fair, the place was kind of shoddy. That was probably just because our water heater sucked. Um, the only thing that was ever in the fridge or the freezer was beer and cigarettes. Nothing to eat. Um, the longer we were there, the worse it got. Um, the place just kind of started degenerating. Like, it was already a little rough when we moved in, but the walls and the ceiling were cracking. The carpet was like melting, which I now can gather was probably from certain utilities that they were using being dropped on the floor. There was crap on the walls. I remember one time I was home alone. I was cleaning up a little bit, and there was this spoon sitting on the table. I figured it was just a dirty spoon someone was eating with, so I was going to take it and try to chuck it in the sink. And when I tried to pull it up, it was melted to the table because someone had set a hot spoon down and it just fused to the cheap tack wood. Um, I did not hang around there for too long. I only lived there for about a year when I split off and I went to live back with my dad. Um, but in the year that I did live there, I mean, it was constantly something. There was times I would wake up in the middle of the night, go out in the living room, and there would be a bunch of strangers there just smoking something, exchanging all kinds of different things, which at that age I couldn't recognize. But now, being an older person, I realize were all manner of different illicit drugs. Um, my mother would disappear a lot for days at a time, sometimes leaving me with these two little kids. Which another thing at the time I just couldn't understand. But now having grown up a bit, I realized she was running off somewhere going on a bender. Um, I I had to leave because of just that was no environment to live in. I can't imagine what happened after I left because I know for a fact that up until a few years later when she got married again, it continued to get worse because my older brother, who I stayed in contact with, he lived there with her after I left. Um, but whatever went on after I was gone, I know eventually led him down the same path that she went down, which is something he still struggles with today. Uh, so all in all, growing up like that, I guess it's just when you're a kid, you don't pick up on that kind of thing. Um, it's clear now as an adult, but when I was little, even if I knew that something was off, I guess I didn't know anything was wrong. Um, but as you grow older, you look back on things and you connect the dots.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Do you mind sharing do you know exactly what your mom was addicted to? Was it fentanyl? Was it heroin, or was it kind of a mix of different things?
Um, it was heroin mostly. I mean, there was other things, alcohol was a big issue. But when you're hooked on opioids, that's something that will take precedent over any kind of other vice you have. Um, and her big thing was heroin. Fentanyl was, at least to my knowledge, not really a big issue in the area yet at this time because we're talking like early 2010s when this happened. Um, and obviously, I could be wrong about that, but I had not, at least at the time, even heard of it yet.
Yeah, I feel like fentanyl is fairly new. Not new, but it wasn't as big as or as well known back then, I think, as it is now, obviously. Um, yeah, you kind of answered some of the questions that I was going to ask. Like, when you're a kid, you don't realize what's going on. But, like, how did you feel when your mother was going through this as a kid? Like, did you think that she was just sick? Did you think that she, was just out having fun? Were you angry at her? Or are you just kind of like accepting that's just how life was since you're a kid and that's what kids do?
Um, I so I had two younger siblings with me. One was, man, I could give you exact ages if I had a minute, but I I would probably have to look up birthdays, which I suppose is a little embarrassing for me to say of my younger siblings, but they were little at the time, safe to say. They were toddlers. They had been born a few years before all of this happened, but things were already going downhill at that point. And I guess when they were born, I in a way stopped being a kid, and I became very observant of things, and I didn't look at them through the same lens that I had before. I knew because of that something was wrong here. Um, and being also kind of a cynical child, I guess, I had kind of an idea of what was up. Um, Not even just that, but having grown up in that environment, obviously I started experimenting with drugs at a young age myself. I knew what weed smelt like. Um, I understood what it meant when I saw a needle laying around. It's just, I guess you hate to accept those kinds of things about the people you care about. Um, and you will look for just any alternative in the moment to say, oh, that's not this. This is something else, no matter how absurd that could be. And I never really had any issues up until we ended up in that duplex, because up to that point, it wasn't that rough. And quite honestly, I was a, you know, 12, 13-year-old who just discovered pot. I was having kind of a good time doing my own thing. So I was able to brush past it. Once we got to the duplex and things really fell apart, um, I guess it was a lot of anger because I was 13 years old, 14 years old, and essentially now a parent to these two kids. Because my older brother was never around. He had a girlfriend at the time and he was always at her place. So when mom would vanish or be passed out on the couch or doing whatever she was doing, all else would fall on me. And that was a lot of pressure, which eventually, I guess, drove me into kind of a depression. The last time I went and I saw her before I split contact completely, because my parents had split custody. I would spend time with my dad, I would spend time with my mother. But the last time I visited her was like Christmas or New Year's or something break from school. I was there for a week straight. I went in my room. As soon as I got there, I laid down on my futon and I did not get up except for to use the bathroom for 7 days straight. And when I was leaving at the end of that trip, I realized that this has got to stop. And I guess at that point, it was more like just detachment. I kind of stopped caring.
I was just gonna ask, like, going back to when you had to take care of your younger sister, like your younger siblings, sorry. Like, did you have to like make excuses for your mother, or like tell your siblings like what was wrong with her, or like tell lies to make it like seem like better than it actually was? Or were they like, did they kind of? I mean, I know they were young, but as they got older, did they kind of know what she was doing, or did you have to like tell them about her?
Um, when this was all going on, they were too young to recognize that there was anything going on. I want to say my brother would have been 2 and my sister would have been like 4 or 5. So My sister, I guess, kind of might have been realizing something was up, but my brother absolutely had no idea what was going on. Uh, so I never really had to explain it to them. They were still to that young enough age where like whatever's going on is just normal to them. They don't know any better. They just accept it. And then when I split contact from my mother, that unfortunately also split me off from them because they were so young that they didn't have phones, they didn't have internet. There was no way for me to speak to them except for through my mother. And that just, it couldn't happen. I couldn't be around her anymore. And up until a couple of weeks, maybe a month ago, I hadn't heard from them except for the few times I'd heard about them through my brother. And then my little sister just messaged me out of the blue one day and essentially told me that she sees why I left, she understands it, and that the same thing is still going on. So when I left, there was no need for it. And now that I am back in contact with them, they already understand it. So I guess I kind of just was not around for that phase of them figuring it out.
Kind of along those same lines, as a kid, did you have to explain to other adults, like teachers or anyone else in your life, like maybe why your mom never showed up to things, or did you kind of have to cover that up? Or did people kind of know what was going on, or did nobody really have any idea?
When I was a kid and going up until I think I was 17, I moved away from the town I was a little kid in. But I finished out high school there. So for my entire school career, at least, I live in a small town. When I lived there, I want to say the population was about 1,000 people. My high school senior class was 64 kids. So it was an absolutely tiny town. Word got around, everyone knew what was up. Which is funny because no one ever even asked if something was going on. We moved there when I was maybe 5 or 6. I think I was in kindergarten. But we moved there already being a family with 2 kids that are getting a little older. And in a town like that, when you come in from somewhere else, it takes a very long time for you to not be an outsider anymore. All of my friends, their families knew each other. They went to the same churches. They went to functions and such together. But my family was a new family in town, so we didn't do any of that. And I think that was probably a lot of the motivation behind no one really prying it, was just that we were a new family. Because even up until almost 10 years later, when I did finally split off from her, no adults ever chimed in thinking there was any kind of issue.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I guess a question I was going to ask is based on your experience growing up with your mom's struggles with addiction and everything that you've kind of lived through. How has that shaped your opinions on the opioid crisis today? Or has it? I mean, I'm assuming you have, having kind of that close connection to it. How has what you've been through kind of shaped what you think about when you think of the opioid crisis today?
Well, I think I just have more of an understanding of what addiction does to a person and sympathy for them. Because not only did I witness her go through that, I've seen other family go through it, and I've also seen a few friends now end up going down that road. And I think that addiction, especially with opioids, is severely misunderstood. I think a lot of people view it as maybe a weakness, which is just absolutely foolish. But that really is what it seems a lot of people think of addiction and addicts in general. It's just that they were too stupid to not get hooked. which is just terrible because, you know, a lot of people who end up on that um, don't start doing it for the high. You know, it's not 1920 anymore. People know what heroin is. People know what morphine is. We know what it does to you. We know um, the effects of the addiction and how addictive it is. You know, 9 cases out of 10, when people take this, they know what they're getting into. Um, a big issue today is that people get prescribed opiates by doctors for a whole litany of different things. And I don't know if it's that they aren't warned enough or they don't understand it, but people get their hands on these things insanely easy as well. Just a few months ago, I was prescribed an opioid. I was prescribed tramadol for a slip disc in my back because of a different health issue. I can't have standard painkillers. Um, I told that to the doctor I was seeing. I don't think he even bothered to fact check it. He was just like, okay, well, we'll give you this instead. Um, a whole bottle of 50 milligram tablets of the stuff. And the issue with that is that it's fine to take it exactly as your doctor tells you to. But if you get that idea in your head of, oh, 1 makes me feel pretty good, so 2 will make me feel great, then you start pushing it and you're going to develop a habit. Um, and that is how a lot of people get hooked on opiates these days. You know, they don't start out with morphine or heroin or fentanyl. They start off with tablets. And I feel like a lot of people just they automatically assume, oh, you're on drugs. It's because you were taking them to get messed up. I think that's terrible, but it's one of those things where you can only learn that it's not so by seeing it firsthand, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, still people today still think a lot of drug addicts are drug addicts. You know, it's their fault. It's like, well, don't take that pill in the first place, right? But like you were saying, a lot of people didn't realize when they were prescribed like the harm it could do. Because I even remember 12 years ago, I was prescribed like oxycodone or something, and I never took it. But I mean, I could have, and I could have gone down that path too, right? It's like that's how easy it can happen. And so there's a lot of stigma obviously still around opioid addiction and just drug addiction in general. Do you think the stigma has changed over the years, maybe say 10, 20 years ago to now? Or do you think it's worse? Is it better? Are people more understanding? Or do you feel like they're as bad as they've always been in understanding this issue?
Um, I think that in areas it's starting to get better. Like you can look out to the West Coast, with states like Oregon, where drugs have been decriminalized and they're now focusing more on treatment. Um, but then you can flip that coin and look at states like Indiana, where we're more focused on prosecution. And I think that has a lot to do with how people view it, is how your state handles it. If you go to a state where they treat drug addicts like people who are addicted to something and need help, you will see more people who understand that these are people who are suffering from something. Whereas if you come to a state where the state is just concerned about catch them, book them, prosecute them, let's see if we can get some money out of them, you're going to see more of those old school views of, you know, these are drug addicts. They are satanic spawn running through our streets. And as we at least hopefully shift towards a more treatment oriented view of drugs, I think that we're going to see the view of drug addicts change with that to a more, these are people who need help. And I think that that's evident by the decriminalization and legalization of marijuana. Because if you look back 20 years to when pot was still illegal nationwide, people still thought it was the devil. You know, they thought that it drove people insane and made them commit all kinds of crimes. But now, 2024, we've gotten to a point where it is legal, at least in America, within a lot of states, and decriminalized in a lot of areas where it isn't legal. And the view of pot has completely changed. It's very rare anymore to find someone who still hates marijuana and thinks that it's evil. And I think that we're going to see a similar shift with other drugs. Of course, we're never going to view opiates as the same way as marijuana because it's not the same thing. But it's going to drift away from, oh, this is evil and people who take it are evil, to understanding, and I think just having more of I guess a realistic view of it and not a paranoid, fearful one.
Yeah, that's a really good point. What is your opinion on things like safe drug supplies? Like we're in Canada and I'm in BC, and we actually have, funded by the government, the safe drug supply. So if you're going to do opioids, come to one of these sites and do a safe stash. Do you think that that's helping? Do you think it's hurting? What is your opinion on like programs like that?
I think that that's fantastic. If you look back, let's say to like the 60s and 70s, when we saw drugs become kind of mainstream with the counterculture, and then as we drifted along further into the 70s, we see drugs go from being psychedelics, marijuana, to heart stuff. The people who were taking this stuff were not taking, like, let's say, heroin that we have today, which a lot of it comes from South America, Central America. What they were taking was pharmaceutical heroin, which is made in a lab. It was made for medical use. It was very clean, very pure stuff. What you get now is, I would compare it to, like, say, cigarettes now. Cigarette companies, they fill smokes up with all kinds of different toxic materials to not only keep you addicted, but to lower costs and not have to use pure tobacco. And we're seeing the same thing going on with drugs like heroin. It's cut with stuff and it's mixed with things to make it cheaper and to help keep people addicted. And that could be completely avoided if we had these safe zones where people can go and they can get clean drugs. And that's something that I think is being demonized a lot because it's being looked at from the view of, oh, what, the government's gonna give people free drugs so they can shoot up and get high? But that's not the case. This is something that is helping these people get along so that they can continue to seek out treatment. I think that a lot of that view of, like, they're just trying to get drugs comes still from just a lack of understanding of addiction and how it works. But I think that as long as we are setting these kinds of clinics up safely and we're doing this responsibly, this is something that could be fantastic for the recovery of millions of people that live here in the Americas.
Yeah. And I think kind of going to what you just said, it is really about implementation of it too, because, there's a good way and probably a bad way to implement these policies of the safe injection sites. And Dusty, I'm kind of more on your side in terms of like, I agree with these approaches. I think that they are a really great thing. I think harm reduction works and saves lives. And we've had another guest on who is the opposite end and doesn't think that they are good. So it's good to have that other perspective. But I agree. And I always look to Portugal, who was one of the first countries to decriminalize drugs. And it really did help them because they had a huge drug problem in the 1980s and 90s. And since they, made, decriminalized drugs in Portugal, I think it was in 2001, we've seen how much of a positive impact that has had. So I think Portugal is kind of a gold standard and kind of an example of when it's implemented right and how it can have a really good positive impact. So it really does come down to, I think, how it's implemented and the policies that surround it. And I think I know in Vancouver, they've decriminalized drugs and gotten a lot of backlash, and maybe now they're kind of going the other way because of the backlash, or they maybe just didn't implement it right or something. So yeah, I think it comes down to stigma too, and how we help to tamper down people's stigmas and thoughts towards people with addictions as well, because that plays a big part in it.
I think that there's definitely a dangerous way to go about this kind of thing. Because if you look back to say the early 1900s, when you could be prescribed morphine, or even further back when you could be prescribed opium, you could just go to a doctor and tell them whatever, and if the doctor could hang, he would write you a script. Um, it it was so easy to get your hands on this stuff, at least for the first time. Obviously, eventually, doctors become wise to it. The pharmacies become wise to it. They're not going to fill your scripts anymore. But it was so easy to get that even today, like I have hanging up on my wall in my living room, I have a prescription for opium from the 1800s, I think. You can just get those. You can find them all over the place for $10 because there's so many of them, because it was so easy to get that way. We have to be responsible about this, because if we're not, then we're just feeding into the problem. But if we are responsible about it and we can use this to help wean people off, then that would be a fantastic breakthrough for treatment of these kinds of addictions.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people see it as an either or, like either you have harm reduction and you're going to allow people to continue to use and that's it, or you're going to enforce treatment and all of that things, where it's like, I think the two can work hand in hand, right? Like you have these safe injection sites to help people along, to make sure that they don't die and overdose. And then when they're ready for treatment, they will have the treatment available. So I think, yeah, they both kind of work hand in hand that way. And I know you mentioned states like Oregon, that have like, are a little bit more maybe progressive in decriminalizing drugs and things like that. And I know you currently live in Indiana, which is a state that's obviously been heavily impacted by the opioid crisis.
Yep.
So can you tell us how local government in Indiana has been dealing with the crisis or not been dealing with it, and what kind of the stance is of the politicians in Indiana about this issue?
The politicians in Indiana have a very strong stance against opioids and opioid addiction. The issue is that it is nothing more than a stance. Nothing is being done to actually help these people or to make access to treatment any easier. There has been plenty of talks and legislation written up and possibly even passed, but none of it amounts to anything. Having known addicts who are in the system and, currently addicted, you are a minor inconvenience to them until they can make some money off you. they will arrest you, search your vehicle, search your person, search your home, whatever, for anything that they can hold against you. Because the more that they can hold against you, the more fines you can end up paying. They don't want to put people in prison because then they're losing money. Then they're having to pay. They're having to pay for you to stay here. They're having to clothe you. They're having to keep the lights on. They're having to feed you. So it is a cycle wherein they catch you, they hold you. Maybe they'll hold you for a month. That is the worst I have heard of someone I know getting after being arrested for felony drug possession. And then they dump you out on the street, come to court, it doesn't matter. They'll just kick the can further down the road, and next time they catch you, now you'll have evasion charges on top of your new charges and your old ones. It is just a giant money-making racket. And I can even speak to that as someone who has been caught up in that racket before. When I was younger, I had a petty possession charge. I had $5 worth of weed in my glove box, and they pressed me to the coals. They had me sitting out on this curb for an hour and a half in the early March cold while they searched through my car, and then they let me go. And for 6 months, they had me just in the meat grinder. They wanted me to pay all kinds of exorbitant fines. They wanted me to do a bunch of hours community service. Thankfully, I was able to afford a good lawyer, because I have had friends also go through something like this with a bad lawyer and ended up with like a year of probation and insane fines. But in the end, for enough marijuana to maybe roll one joint, I had about 6 months of fighting the charge and a few $1,000s in fines I ended up paying out, not including my lawyer's fees. It's all about money. And what further makes me believe that is just how hard it is to get into rehab in this state. I could be wrong, but as far as I'm aware, the only inpatient rehab clinics in Indiana are in Indianapolis. When my brother went to rehab, we tried to find somewhere for him to go in state, but even if we did find anywhere, there was just no way to get him in because it's so overcrowded, because the infrastructure just isn't there in this state. So we ended up having to send him to Chicago to go through rehab. There's no investment in treatment in this state. All about prosecution. Cops are trained to handle drug addicts and drugs like criminals and to treat them as such. And that's as far as it goes. So I think Indiana just is completely dropping the ball with this, which isn't surprising. We've been a red state for forever now. And it seems like every time we take a step forward in this area, it comes with 3 steps back.
Yeah, it's interesting. It makes me think, yeah, you're right. Just like it's all about money, but maybe instead of, forcing people to go to jail, they could have like mandatory rehab centers. I don't know if this is a thing or if you're allowed to force someone to go to rehab against their will, but it's either that or prison. And some people just need kind of like that time for clarity to clear their head enough while they're in rehab to be like, yes, this is actually what I need. So I don't know. Is that like a solution, or what do you think a solution is? Like, is like mandatory rehabs for people that have been caught like a good idea, a thing? Like, what do you think?
I don't know if we do that in Indiana, but I do know that Illinois does that. When my brother was in rehab, there was quite a few people there who were there. They weren't forced to be there. How it works is when you go before the judge, you're given the option. Either you can do the time in jail or you can do the time in rehab, which has actually been around for a pretty long time. The issue with sending someone to rehab is that, first off, you're essentially in prison now. You're not in a prison, but you're not able to leave this rehab clinic until you have served your sentence. And I don't think that promotes a healthy environment to do the healing in. Because some of these rehab clinics really are like prisons. I went to visit my brother quite a few times at the one that he was in, and granted, it was in a bad area of Chicago. But you go in there and you get in the waiting room, and there's like plate glass in front of the reception area that you have to get buzz past, and then you go through these giant metal doors into this hallway where you'll go through another set of metal doors where you actually get into an office. And once you're through the office, through another metal door, you get into what was the rehab clinic, which was more like a hospital. It was a couple of corridors with more metal doors on either side that you could go through. And this one was the cafeteria. This one was, a therapist's office. This one was like the group room. But they weren't even allowed to just wander around the floor. They had like a living area upstairs where they had their privacy, their free time. But when you came downstairs, they were walked in lines like prisoners. Of course, this is all Midwest rehab, which is entirely different from something that you would see like out in California, where they treat them like people. So I guess I think that I don't think it should be mandatory. I don't think you should be sentenced to rehab. I think it's good that you're given the choice, even if it is between jail and rehab, because at least you're still making the decision. But once you're in the rehab clinic, I think the only way it's really going to work is if you're given the feeling that you were there to heal and not there as a punishment. Because if you don't want to get better from an addiction, you won't. You have to want to do it. It has to be your decision.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say too. Like, comes down to, yeah, you have to make the choice to want to get better. And I think, yeah, like drug courts would giving you that option to go to rehab or jail. I think obviously it's great to have that option, but it's like, yes, you're choosing it, but if you're just choosing it as a way to avoid jail, will it be successful for you? Maybe you'll do your time, then you'll get out, and will you end up, going back to addiction the same way you did before? And many people will go like to treatment 5, 6, 7 more times before they actually get better. So yeah, it is important. Like, you have to, like what you said, it really is, you have to want it, right? Can't be something that's kind of imposed upon you or forced upon you, because that isn't really gonna work.
I was just sorry, Katie. I was just gonna ask, like, did your mom ever go to rehab, or was she like, is that something she did, or she didn't want to, or?
I don't think she ever did. At least I never heard of her doing it. I'm still completely out of contact with her. Not just because of the addiction thing, among other things, but she has never accepted that she has a problem. And I know that that's still the case, having now spoken with my little sister about it. She just refuses to see that there is an issue. And it's like we were saying, if you don't see the problem and you don't want to change it, there is no getting better. You can go to rehab over and over and over and over again, but you can never be forced into recovering from addiction.
Yeah, that was gonna be my next question. Like, does she like think she has a problem, or she just is in denial? But you answered my question, so.
Yeah, definitely an issue with denial, which I mean, honestly, who's to say how much of it is denial and how much of it is just not wanting to get off it? Because this is a substance that it alters your brain chemistry. You're not you once you start taking it. You are a fiend for the substance. And there are, I won't say moments of clarity, because I think that there is more clarity than there is confusion and lust for the substance. You can see from a lot of people who talked about their addictions. They're aware they're addicted and they're aware of the effects it's having on them, but the craving for the substance a lot of the time outweighs that. And until you get to the point where you can not even overcome the craving, because that's the whole detox process. Just until you get to the point where you're ready to let it go and you've accepted letting it go, um, you can't let it go. And the denial is a part of that. But I think that a long time before you're ever ready to let it go, you come out of that denial and you live outside of it for a while.
Yeah, and I think once you've lived a certain lifestyle for so long, regardless if it's addiction or something else, it's really hard to get out of. And you're just not, comfortable with change. You don't know how to even live a different way. So yeah, definitely that like mindset is there for sure. Um, One thing I was curious about, like your brother struggles with your older brother struggles with addiction as well. So why do you think, I mean, you could have easily went down that path as well. So what do you think determined you to not, you know, fall into the same patterns as they did? Was it maybe because you were there looking after your siblings, kind of seeing what it was doing to them, sort of thing? Like, what do you think, like, set you apart?
When I was young, I was on a medication called trileptal for epilepsy. Uh, and one of the side effects of trileptal is drowsiness, which is an absolutely absurd understatement. I spent, from whenever I was prescribed that medication, like 4 years old, I don't know, until around the time I left. I think it was probably about the time we moved into that duplex. Um, I got off of it, essentially just a walking zombie. Um, Whenever I would take it, and I think that that is one thing that definitely separated the two of us, is that and also just being the older sibling, he has a couple of years before I came around to remember it, but he was never able to deal with the divorce and not being a family anymore. And I know that's something he's struggled with and drove a lot of his substance use. But then also on top of that, having come out, I guess essentially becoming aware and sentient suddenly at 13 years old, uh, I was not interested in anything that was going to numb me, uh, because all of a sudden I was alive. I wasn't just floating through the days anymore. I was real now. And at the same time, thanks to the people who were around because of this duplex, I was able to start really getting my hands on psychedelics. Uh, and I got into those for a couple of years. And I think that having that at such a young age influenced me as a person to not be interested in things that are going to close me off in the way that opioids will. Because like when I had the prescription for opioids, I all of a sudden, as someone who is the child of an opioid addict and related to many other, I have a predisposition to addiction to these kinds of things. I took the first dose and I hated it. Granted, I went into this already knowing I was probably not going to enjoy it because I've had morphine before at the hospital and I hated that too. Uh, but I, I don't see what they see, I guess. Because opioids are a kind of drug. They're a numbing drug. They're one that makes things not matter. To illustrate that point, when I did get the morphine, I was in the hospital because I was passing a kidney stone. And for people who have never passed a kidney stone before, I was told by every nurse in that hospital, every female nurse, that they would compare the pain to childbirth. And when they gave me the morphine, it didn't stop hurting. I just didn't care anymore. And that's what I think a lot of people who end up hooked on these substances are seeking out, is a way to make it not matter to them anymore. Because the more, not only are you now on this substance and that's terrible, the more you take it, generally the worse position you're going to end up in, thus feeding into you wanting to take more so that it just won't matter to you. So long way of saying essentially what it came down to, he prefers numbing his mind so he doesn't have to think about it. I prefer something that's going to open my mind and force me to look at myself. I'm not interested in shutting down like that.
That's super interesting that you have that perspective of being on that prescription. When you were on that prescription, you said it was kind of like a walking zombie. Like in your mind, did you know that that was happening to you, or you didn't kind of realize it until you got off of it and, knew what you used to be like on it? Or did you, what was it like on it versus off it? Did you have that clarity? Did it come afterwards? Or because you were so young, it's maybe hard to describe as well, but I just think that's so interesting.
I definitely didn't realize it at the time. I feel as though I was maybe not as informed on the medication as I could have been, which is definitely partially my fault because I have a habit of not listening to that kind of stuff. I like to, selective listening is a real big issue for me. But it was frustrating being a kid who, everyone thought I was stupid because I would do terrible in class because I couldn't pay attention. And it's not that I couldn't pay attention because I was getting distracted or I wasn't interested. Like, I was fighting to stay awake. I can remember being an elementary schooler and sitting at my desk first thing in the morning when the medication's finally starting to kick in, and like my eyes literally rolling back into my head and my eyelids closing because I was falling asleep at my desk with medication. And I didn't realize it was doing that to me, for one thing, just because I was constantly being told by people who also didn't really understand what was going on that it was me who was the issue. And, not only being a little kid, but being a little kid who's told that since always, since before even having a school career, I just accepted that it was true, that I was just dumb. Come to find out, when I did get off it, I went to one of those after school learning program things, because at this point I'm now a seventh grader who's missed a lot of his school career because of this medication. I needed help catching up. But for the initial evaluation test, they found out that as a seventh grader, I was reading at senior level. So it was actually a pretty big shock to me when I first got off it to find out that, like, I'm not just a moron. I actually had something going on that was inhibiting me. And that's something I still even deal with today, is just like, I guess, underestimating myself and then undermining myself, because having that childhood experience set me up to expect very little from myself, and that's a hard thing to break. But eventually I did get out of that, and as I've grown and continued getting older, I I've become just fascinated with my own sentience, I guess. I will never spend another day just floating along. I'm always looking around, paying attention, um, just trying to notice every little detail because I feel like I missed out on so much, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing your experience. And I had another question here that I wanted to ask. Was, as someone who has that lived experience in your family with addiction, what would your main piece of advice be to anyone who might be listening who's either addicted to opioids themselves or has a family member who is addicted? If you have like one piece of advice that you would like to share to anyone who might be listening.
If you are a person who is addicted, my advice to you is to take the cure. Uh, it is a terrible cycle that you are caught in right now. And unfortunately, it is the only way out. It is absolute hell to detox from that. And it's different for everybody. You know, it could last 5 days. It could be 10 days of it. It could be 2 weeks. But it is the only way to ever escape it. Um, and if you're someone who loves someone who's addicted, my best advice to you is to accept that they may never get better. Opioids are just an absolute nightmare of a substance that are not like any other addiction on this planet. Uh, and quite frankly, it's not something that everyone is going to beat.
Yeah, I think we're like getting close to our like allotted hour time slot. I don't know, Katie or Steph, if you had any last questions for Dusty, or if Dusty, if you had any kind of final comments you wanted to make um, before we end it here.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks, and I think you're a great storyteller. Everything you've been saying has been super interesting. And yeah, I can feel like your passion when you're talking about this. So, yeah, thanks for bringing that to us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. This is great.
Do you hope your mom gets better, or do you think it's something that will never? I know we're almost at the end of the time, but kind of a question that I wanted to ask at the beginning, but kind of fits now. Like, do you hope she gets the help she needs, or do you think she just won't, like, she won't accept the help ever?
Given the cycle she's been through so many times now, and having seen that this is a cycle that is repeated for generations, I get the feeling that she is not going to break it. I hope for her sake that one day she does, so that she can have the clarity to see what's been going on. But I'm not going to hold my breath.
Oh, I also I wanted to also echo what Katie said, and I think you're a great storyteller as well. Like as you were talking, all the questions we asked you, as your answers were, very in depth, and it was very, so intriguing and interesting to listen to you. So I thank you so much for being with us this afternoon to talk about this, and it's a really important issue. So I do definitely appreciate your insight and your experience, and yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's been great.
Or I was just gonna say thank you, and like, I just want to say I hope that your family can. Hope she gets some help, and I hope you can share your stories with others, because I think it's a great story to be told.
Thank you.
Well, not a great story, but like a story that I
Yeah,
think everybody should hear.
for sure.
Yeah, it's important for sure.
It's something that I like to write about. I think that that's the best thing that I can do to help others going through this, is that with my writing, to put a spotlight on the situation so people can learn about what it really is like, and to do things like this, to come on and be given the opportunity to talk about it, that you guys have given me. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, and all the best to you, and all the best to your family, and we hope everything is okay. And yeah, thank you so much again, Dusty. It was great chatting with you, and yeah, all the best.
Thank you.